The worst problem I've ever had in my entire life is the one I'm going through right now. Isn't that how we all are? We don't tend to get much perspective on the things that we're going through. We have difficulty backing up and looking at the problems we face in some kind of perspective. So I want to talk to you this morning about a totally different kind of problem that one person faced, and yet through it I want you to understand that we get through things. We live. We get beyond. There is hope. This is a true story of hope written by a lady named Ruby Bridges Hall. Here's her story. Under federal court order, New Orleans public schools were finally forced to desegregate. In the spring of 1960, I took a test along with other black kindergartners in the city to see who would go to an integrated school come September. That summer, my parents learned I'd passed the test and had been selected to start first grade at William Frantz Public School. I was born in Mississippi in 1954, the oldest child of Abon and Lucille Bridges. That year, the United States Supreme Court handed down its landmark decision ordering the integration of public schools. Not that I knew anything about school at the time. What I knew and loved was growing up on the farm that my paternal grandparents sharecropped. It was a very hard life though, and my parents heard there were better opportunities in the city. We moved to New Orleans, where my father found work as a service station attendant, and my mother took night jobs to help support our growing family. As I got a bit older, my job was to keep an eye on my younger brothers and sister, which wasn't too difficult, except for church and the long walk to the all-black school where I went to kindergarten. Our world didn't extend beyond our block. That was about to change. My mother was all for it. My father wasn't. "We're just asking for trouble," he said. He thought things weren't going to change, that blacks and whites would never be treated as equals. Mama thought I would have an opportunity to get a better education if I went to the new school, and a chance for a good job later in life. My parents argued about it and prayed about it. Eventually, my mother convinced my father that despite the risks, they had to take this step forward, not just for their own children, but for all black children. A federal judge decreed that Monday, November 14th, 1960, would be the day black children in New Orleans would go to school with white children. There were 6 of us chosen to integrate the city's public school system. 2 decided to stay in their old schools. The other 3 were assigned to McDonough. I would be going to William Frantz alone. The morning of November 14th, federal marshals drove my mother and me the 5 blocks to William Frantz. In the car, one of the men explained that when we arrived at the school, 2 marshals would walk in front of us and 2 behind, so we'd be protected on both sides. That reminded me of what Mama had taught us about God, that He's always there to protect us. "Ruby Nell," she said as we pulled up to the new school, "don't you be afraid. There might be some people upset outside, but I'll be with you." Sure enough, people shouted and shook their fists when we got out of the car. But to me, it wasn't any noisier than Mardi Gras. I held my mother's hand and followed the marshals through the crowd, up the steps into the school. We spent that whole day sitting in the principal's office. Through the window, I saw white parents pointing at us and yelling, then rushing their children out of the school. In the uproar, I never got to my classroom. The marshals drove my mother and me to school again the next day. I tried not to pay attention to the mob. Someone had a black doll in a coffin, and that scared me more than the nasty things people screamed at us. A young white woman met us inside the building. She smiled at me. "Good morning, Ruby Nell," she said, just like Mama, except with what I later learned was a Boston accent. "Welcome, I'm your new teacher, Mrs. Henry." She seemed nice, but I wasn't sure how to feel about her. I'd never been taught by a white teacher before. Mrs. Henry took my mother and me to the second floor classroom. All the desks were empty, and she asked me to choose a seat. I picked one up front, and Mrs. Henry started teaching me the letters of the alphabet. The next morning, my mother told me she couldn't go to school with me. She had to work and look after my brothers and sister. "The marshals will take good care of you, Ruby Nell," Mother assured me. "Remember, if you get afraid, say your prayers." You can pray to God anytime, anywhere. He'll always hear you. That was how I started praying on the way to school. The things people yelled at me didn't seem to touch me. Prayer was my protection. After walking up the steps, past the angry crowd though, I was glad to see Mrs. Henry. She gave me a hug and she sat right by my side instead of at the big teacher's desk in the front of the room. Day after day, it was just Mrs. Henry and me working on my lessons. Militant segregationists, as the news called them, took to the streets in protest. The riots erupted all over the city. My parents shielded me as best they could, but I knew problems had come to our family because I was going to a white school. My father was fired from his job. The white owners of a grocery store told us not to shop there anymore. Even my grandparents in Mississippi suffered. The owner of the land they'd sharecropped for 25 years said everyone knew it was their granddaughter causing the trouble in New Orleans, and he asked them to move. At the same time, there were a few white families who braved the protest and kept their children in school, but they weren't in my class, so I didn't see them. People from around the country who had heard about me on the news sent letters and donations. A neighbor gave my father a job painting houses. Other folks babysat for us, watched our house to keep away troublemakers, and even walked behind the marshal's car on my way to school. My family couldn't have made it without our friends and neighbors' help. Me? I couldn't have gotten through that year without Mrs. Henry. Sitting next to her in our classroom, just the two of us, I was able to forget the world outside. She made school fun. We did everything together. I couldn't go in the schoolyard for recess, so right in the room we played games and for exercise did jumping jacks to music. I remember her explaining integration to me and why some people were against it. It's not easy for people to change once they've gotten used to living a certain way, Ms. Henry said. Some of them don't know any better, and they're afraid. But not everyone is like that. Even though I was only 6, I understood what she meant. The people I passed every morning as I walked up to the school were full of hate. They were white, yet so was my teacher, who couldn't have been more different from them. She was one of the most loving people I'd ever known. The greatest lesson I learned that year in Miss Henry's class was the lesson Martin Luther King Jr. tried to teach us all. Never judge people by the color of their skin. God makes each of us unique in ways that go so much deeper. From her window, Mrs. Henry always watched me walk into the school. One morning when I got to our classroom, she said she had been surprised to see me talking to the mob. I saw your lips moving, she said, but I couldn't make out what you were saying to those people. I wasn't talking to them, I told her. I was praying for them. Usually I prayed in the car on the way to school, but that day I'd forgotten until I was in the crowd. Please be with me, I asked God, and be with those people too. Forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Ruby Dale, you are truly someone special, Mrs. Henry whispered, giving me an even bigger hug than usual. She had that look on her face like my mother would get when I'd done something to make her proud. Oh, I hope you face a day today with prayer in your heart. Enough to make your mama proud. Have a good day.